to welcome everyone to today's soil seminar. Just a quick reminder that today's seminar is being recorded. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so if you feel comfortable to unmute yourself, that is totally okay, as well as using the chat box, so we'll keep that monitored. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. His name is Matthew Streeter. He received his bachelor's from Iowa State in soil and environmental science and continued with his master's in pedology. He's currently a soil scientist at Iowa Geological Survey and is finishing up his doctorate degree in soil morphology and genesis here at Iowa State. Some of his research interests include soil health, agriculture crop production, wetland soil restoration and hydrology, ergonomic soil sustainability, soil-water interactions in terms of nutrient storage and transport via groundwater, and soil erosion and deposition. Today, we will be presenting on soil health and water quality in the roadside ditches. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Streeter.
All right, so as Valeria said, I work for the Iowa Geological Survey. I've been at the survey now since 2013, actually. One of the great things about the Iowa Geological Survey is that we have a mission to serve the entire state of Iowa, and that entails a lot of different work in a lot of different parts of the state. So I get to travel around and, really northwest to southeast, northeast to southwest, all corners of the state. And we get to do a lot of unique work in a lot of unique areas. So I do work in wetlands some, work in traditional agricultural fields. We've worked in golf courses. And one of the more interesting kind of landscapes that we've begun to work in the past couple of years are roadside ditches. And so I thought I'd share a little bit about our roadside ditch work, really because I think it's an underserved landscape area, and really it's got a lot of potential interest in terms of soil health and water quality benefits. So this work that I'm going to talk about today was something that we did in 2017 in collaboration with myself and Keith Schilling, who's our state geologist at the Iowa Geological Survey. We worked with Marty St. Clair, who's a chemist at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, and also Justin Meissen at the UNI Tallgrass Prairie Center. So a nice collaboration there. Now, the first question is why roadside ditches? So if you think about, a typical roadside ditch that's lining a state highway in Iowa, you maybe get somewhere between, 6 to 10 meters wide of perennial vegetation, times 2 for both sides of the ditch. And then if you think about the United States, these roadside ditches line more than 6.3 million kilometers of public roads in the US. So we have this massive amount of area that's being managed under a roadside ditch, and we really don't think about that a lot. Now, if you think about roadsides and what they actually do, these are cutting straight across watersheds and not necessarily, in line with water flow. So these are cutting across watersheds, and they are concentrating overland water in a specific location, not necessarily at a typical natural pour point of a watershed. And then they're directing that flow in a new path. So one of the questions that I want to ask and try to answer throughout this presentation is, are ditches biogeochemical hotspots? Now, a biogeochemical hotspot is something like a wetland or a restored oxbow or someplace like that has a lot of potential for nutrient reduction benefits like denitrification. And I want to look at these roadside ditches in terms of, can we use these for nutrient processing? So are these ditches biogeochemical hotspots? So our project was funded in 2016 by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and we had 3 main goals for this project. As a preliminary goal, we wanted to determine how much land was actually draining into roadside ditches in our watershed area of interest. So how much land are we actually talking about here that could be manipulated by these roadside ditches? We wanted to evaluate the groundwater nutrient processing capacity. So how much nitrate could we actually reduce by flowing water through these ditches? And then we wanted to characterize the soil sedimentation within these ditches, because these ditches receive a lot of sediments from agricultural catchments that are feeding into these, and we wanted to see how much we're actually storing in the ditches. Now, the area that we chose to do work in was Lime Creek Watershed in Buchanan County. So that's over by Independence. The north end of Lime Creek Watershed just touches the city of Independence, and the far south end of that watershed just tips over into Benton County, and it's near the town of Brandon. And if you know of Brandon at all, it's the home of the world's largest frying pan. So as I was doing work in Iowa roadside ditches near Brandon, I saw the big frying pan a lot of times. So it's totally a hop off the interstate and check it out. The Lime Creek watershed overall, it's 66 square kilometers, so it's not a huge watershed, but in that watershed, it's 79% row crop, so very heavily row crop dominated, not a lot of conservation practices. There's a lot of tillage that's happening in that watershed. There's not a lot of terraces, not a lot of grass waterways or anything like that. There is about 12% perennial vegetation in the watershed, and that's mostly lining Lime Creek proper. There is a nitrate sensor in Lime Creek, and that's down near the town of Brandon, so near where we're at the base of the watershed where this is spilling over. And you can see here in this graph, I'm going to pull up my mouse just a little bit, that this red line here is the nitrate concentrations that were measured in that Nitratax sensor. And all this data is available through the Iowa Water Quality Information System. And what you can see that in the spring, from April through about July, that the nitrate levels, the average nitrate in that stream was up here well above 10, maybe nearing 15 milligrams per liter. Now, if we think about, EPA water quality standards for drinking water, that cutoff is maybe around 10. And so we certainly have interest in Lime Creek to work on nutrient reduction. So this is a slide that just shows a typical ditch design for the DOT. Now, in our site, in our sites, we chose both gravel roads and pavements. And some of the gravel roads are a little bit smaller and some of the pavements are a little bit larger. But in general, the base of the ditch, so where water is actually going to flow through that ditch, is about 3 meters wide. And then the normal depth of that ditch, the overall depth, is about 1.5 meters. And that would be pretty standard for the state highway. In some of the gravel roads, it gets a little narrower. It's typically still about that deep. I'll say that Interstate 380 runs right across Lime Creek Watershed, and we tried really hard to get in there to do some work in the 4-lane waterways as well, in those ditches. But the DOT wouldn't let us in, wouldn't let me in to do well installation. So we had to forego the 4-lane highways. We stuck with the state highways and the gravel roads. So our focus was specifically on roadside ditches that were getting a considerable amount of water flowing into them. So if you see here in my diagram, you have a catchment on the left side, where we have a catchment that has a significant amount of water. It's flowing into the ditch, but it looks like it's immediately flowing out of the ditch through a culvert, or sometimes they're flowing into tiles, or they might be flowing directly into a stream. That wasn't really the focus of our study. Instead, we were focused on agricultural catchments that had a considerable amount of flow that was flowing into a ditch and then traveling down that ditch for an amount of time that would allow for infiltration of that water to occur before it exited. So our ditches that we chose were varying lengths, but ultimately we were looking for a ditch that was long enough that had time for that infiltration to actually happen, so that we could potentially have processing. And you can see, I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but you can see our goal here was to have sampling sites in a transect from up gradient to down gradient across that ditch, so that we could monitor the changes in groundwater quality as that water percolated through the ditch. So for that preliminary question, that very first question we wanted to answer, how much of Lime Creek watershed was actually draining to a ditch? I worked with Calvin Walter with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. He's a GIS analyst, and he helped us create a roadside road buffer. So essentially he buffered the road coverage for the watershed. And then we used a flow accumulation raster that was developed with the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework Toolbox, looked at those intersections between the flow accumulation rasters and the roadside ditch buffer. And we were able to determine that about 30% of Lime Creek watershed is draining directly into a roadside ditch. So a pretty big amount of the overall watershed area is draining right into a ditch. And you'll see here in this map that I've provided, there's the red dots going from north to south. There's 6 different sites, 6 different ditches that we ended up choosing that were receiving a significant amount of flow. Now, one thing that I'd like you to pay attention to is this number 5 here. We're going to talk about this a couple of times. So it's a fairly large watershed area. We'll come back to that. And then the other thing I'd like to note is this one clear down here in the south end by Brandon, this site number 11 was actually shallow to bedrock. And so instead of having 18 wells, we have 17. And that's because this site down here at 11 only had 2 sampling sites because of that shallow bedrock issue. So for that site selection, to select those 6 sites, again, we pulled up that flow accumulation raster and we looked for areas where we had a significant amount of flow that was intersecting with a ditch. So if you see these areas, oh, I apologize. So if you see these areas between 9A and 10, you can see this dark line that's intersecting a roadside ditch. And this area would be a region where we're getting significant accumulation into the ditch. So those were our priority sites, and we decided to work with 6 of those. And then at this site, we chose an up gradient location for a well and a down low gradient location for a well. And then we picked a middle well where we monitored continuous groundwater levels for the entire study period. So here you can see that same photo, except it's an aerial image, and you can see the grassed waterway that's right between 9A and 10. So that's that significant flow that I was talking about, and that's evidenced by that grass waterway. Now, what we did to look at these ditches, we installed these monitoring wells that I've been talking about. We did soil sampling within the ditches. We did a bulk density analysis. We measured the infiltration rates within these ditches. We did an elevation survey so that we could actually talk about the hydraulic gradient between the up gradient wells and the down gradients and get an idea about how much water is actually moving through that soil. Like I said, Justin Meissen worked with us from UNI, and he did a roadside ditch vegetation survey for us. And I didn't have a lot to do with that. I'll just share briefly the results of that. And then we did monthly water quality sampling for that year in 2017. For the well installations, I've got several nice pictures here. We used a hand auger, so I'm a licensed well driller with the state, but they wouldn't let me get my drill rig into the roadside ditches. So we put these in by hand, and we used an open bit with a hand auger. So we actually got some pretty nice cores compared to a normal closed bit hand auger. The samples were pretty nice. They were 12-foot wells, about 3.5 meters, and the bottom 5 foot of those wells had a PVC screen. So we're actually collecting groundwater from about 7 to 12 feet below the ground surface and collected a soil sample at each one of those well locations. For the roadside vegetation survey, again, I wasn't there, but I want to just briefly describe to you what the findings were. So Justin did this in July of 2017. He did it in full bloom, which I think is pretty standard. And he went to each one of our 6 sites and he randomly selected several 1 meter squares within those roadside ditches. And then he identified all the species in those sampling spots and then assessed the canopy cover for each one of those species. And just briefly, this is what he found. In our 6 roadside ditches, about 1/3 of those ditches were dominated by native vegetation. About 1/3 of those ditches, you can see 5 and 7, were dominated by introduced vegetation. And about 1/3 of those ditches were dominated by a mix of native and introduced species. We had 4 of our ditch sites that were dominated by grasses, 1 that was dominated by forbs, and 1 that was a mixture. And the dominant species that he found in most of these, as you can imagine, in a lot of these state highways, especially in the locations where they had been mowed, was a smooth brome grass. In a little bit of the wetter areas, we had the reed canary and some native sedges. So that gives you an idea about the vegetation in these locations. Now for infiltration, we did a double ring infiltrometer to measure infiltration, but we used a little bit of a unique setup. So I want to describe that because some of these ditches were a little bit incised at the bottom of them, and some were a little narrower and some were a little wider. And so I had some concerns about the large typical double ring infiltrometers. So instead, what I did is I used a smaller turf grass double ring infiltrometer. There's a picture of it there on the right. And then we did duplicates of that, actually triplicates. We did 3 samples at each well location. And of course, there's 3 wells within each ditch. So we have 9 of these infiltration measurements that were averaged for that ditch length. So that's our infiltration. And you can see that the average infiltration here in the second column was around 0.3 millimeters per minute, fairly standard. For the bulk density, we collected 2 different depths in duplicate at each one of those well locations, and again, averaged those for bulk density. You can see our bulk densities here are fairly typical. Notice that this ditch 5 here is a little lower on, on the bulk density. This location, and I'll bring this up a couple of different times, had a flowing tile that was actually dumping into the ditch. And so it had flowing water for a large part of the year. And this ditch had incised quite a bit. And also because of the water that was flowing, it had a lot of vegetation and a lot of biomass. So because of that kind of undecomposed organic matter, our bulk densities near that surface were a little bit lower. And you're going to see some changes in our groundwater levels as well because of this flowing tile. Now, we estimated that with these infiltration rates that we're approximately getting 200,000 liters per day of infiltration into these roadside ditches. So quite a bit of water that can infiltrate into this environment. For water quality sampling, we did monthly analyses for most of the year. There were a couple of times in the spring where we got some bi-weekly sampling because we had a lot of water moving and we were pretty interested. So we would go out to each one of these wells with a peristaltic pump so that we wouldn't get a lot of turbation in the wells. We collected those samples and we gave those to Marty St. Clair at Coe College to run for nutrient analysis. Now, I'm not going to share a lot about the phosphorus. We did measure orthophosphorus, but there was virtually no phosphorus found in any of these wells. So I didn't even really bother to share that data here today. I'm going to focus on the nitrates more. Now, for the groundwater level monitoring, I said that we had that middle well of the transect that we installed a pressure transducer in, and we got continuous groundwater level monitoring throughout the year. You can see that for most of these, for 5 of the 6 different transects, that we have fairly high water levels. And then about in July, you know, we're about 5 meters from a cornfield. We expect, this is pretty typical, we can see that that groundwater is going to start to decrease. Now, if you look at number 5, you see a very quick drop off in that groundwater level. This is indicating when that tile stopped flowing into that ditch at sometime around the 1st of August. For the nitrogen concentration pattern, so these results, what we're actually seeing from up gradient to down gradient in these wells. In general, in 4 of these 6 wells, we saw a decrease in the nitrates from that up gradient position to the down gradient position. Now, in 2 of the sites, I'm only showing 4 graphs here because in 2 of the sites, we didn't see any nitrate at all. So it's hard to see a change when there's 0 to begin with. But in 4 of those sites, we did see a reduction in nitrate from up gradient to down gradient. In the top right graph, that is showing that well 5, again, that ditch 5, and those black dots are showing the average tile levels for nitrate. So you can see that the tile is pumping out nitrate levels maybe between 15 and 20 milligrams per liter. So quite a bit of nitrate coming out of that tile. But on average, at these 4 sites where we actually detected that reduction, we saw a reduction from 10.6 to 4.3 milligrams per liter in the groundwater. So that was a 60% reduction in nitrates from the up gradient to the down gradient well location. So let's assume the 60% reduction that we identified. And then if we assume that average infiltration of about 0.3 millimeters per minute that we identified, and then if we assume that runoff water coming from that field, not the tile water, but runoff water that's coming from most of these fields has a nitrate concentration of somewhere between 1 and 2 milligrams per liter, we would get an approximate nitrogen reduction rate of between 0.2 and 0.4 grams per meter squared per day. Now that rate right there is very similar to rates that we would find in a restored oxbow or in a wetland environment. So at the very first slide, I said, are these roadside ditches biogeochemical hotspots? Do they act like oxbows or wetlands? And I think that as far as nitrate reduction is concerned, we can say, yeah, there's a lot of potential for these sites to concentrate, flow, and be used for nitrogen reduction. Now let's move on to the soils for just a few minutes. So at each one of these sites where we did the well installation, again, we collected those soil samples during that process. And you can see that's a sample that we collected on the left there that I'm describing from a roadside ditch. On the right, you'll see a colleague of mine that was collecting surface samples. We collected surface samples in a transect from the roadside all the way through the bottom of the ditch and to the side of the field. And we did an analysis for heavy metals. We used a PXRF and did heavy metal analysis. And I don't think I have time to go through the heavy metal analyses today, but I want you to be aware that we collected them. If you're interested, you can look later. But so we did those soil sampling in those well locations, and we found some pretty interesting results. So just to summarize the morphology, we had extensive sedimentation that was occurring since these ditches were created. We contacted the county engineers, and they have dates on when they clean out the ditches. And when they clean out a ditch, they essentially take all of the sediment material, anything that we might call an A horizon that's filled into the ditch. They cut that back out and get back down to a subsoil. And they do that approximately every 30 years. So, and that was kind of, for most of our sites, they were somewhere around a 30-year mark since they had been dug out. So the mean depth of our A horizon in this case in about 30 years was 22 centimeters. And some of these, of course, were a little deeper and some were a little less. And these were very abrupt boundaries between this A horizon material and the subsoil. And most of these subsoils had either some type of a cambic weak B horizon, or they were glade, so we would have some BG horizons under most of these A horizons. Now I'm going to describe or share with you just some of the chemistry that we collected from these soils. And I'm going to do this based on the A, B, and C horizons that we described. Now, if you look here in this graph, I'm showing you the soil organic matter in the A horizons was averaging over 3%, and in the B and the C horizons, less than 1. If we look at total carbon, again, much higher in the A horizons than in the B or the C. Total nitrogen, this is times 10, much higher in the A horizon compared to the B or the C horizon. For soil chemistry, again, we did nitrate, look at soil nitrates, much higher in the A horizon. We also looked at calcium, much higher in the A horizon. And then we looked at the soil texture as well. So we did particle size analysis, and you can see that the silt, much higher in that A horizon, and the clay, much lower in that A horizon. And of course, we think about silt when we think about sedimentation, because those sand particles that are getting moved around in the field a little bit are mostly getting redeposited in that field in the catchment area. And then a lot of the clay is getting into suspension. It's moving on out of the system. So in areas where we have a lot of silt, we can think about sedimentation that's occurring. So to summarize all of that, to bring this all together, we have silt, clay, total carbon, soil organic matter, total nitrogen, nitrate, and calcium, all significantly different in that A horizon compared to that subsoil. Now, we did a couple of estimates of the stocks for carbon and soil organic matter because we had the bulk density measurements. And we estimated that we had about 16 kilograms per meter of road ditch of soil organic matter that we were storing. So that's on a per meter basis, of course, because all 6 of our ditches were varying lengths. They weren't all the same length, and we needed some way to normalize that. And so we decided to report this on a per meter basis. So 16 kilograms of soil organic matter per meter of road ditch, and total carbon about half of that, 8 kilograms per meter. So we're storing quite a bit of carbon in these roadside ditch environments. Now, again, I mentioned that the length of these ditches varied. So we had a range between 200 and about 466 meters. That sediment depth, the average sediment depth was 22 centimeters. You can see that it ranged from about 12 to 28. Notice that that really low value, that 12 value for sediment depth, is in ditch 5. So that's that ditch that's getting that tile flow, and it's incising. So we're actually getting an erosive environment rather than purely depositional. So we were still getting a deposition, especially in kind of almost a unique floodplain environment within that ditch, but a lot less sediment that's being stored. For the ditch width, I mentioned at the beginning that a typical bottom width was about 3 meters, but that sediment really wasn't that wide in any of our ditches. So this is the width of the sediment within the base of that ditch, ranging between about 1.5 meters to nearly 3 meters in some cases. And with that data, we were able to calculate a total volume of sediment for that ditch. And again, we looked at this volume and we compared these ditches by turning that volume into a volume per meter of ditch so we could make the comparisons. We used the bulk density data that we gathered to estimate a total sediment storage within these roadside ditches. So you can see that we have a range of between 239 kilograms of sediment, that's just the sediment, per meter of ditch, all the way up to 988 kilograms per meter. So quite a bit lower in that ditch 5 where we had that incision happening, and quite a bit higher in ditch 3 that was a longer ditch in a big watershed area with a pretty low slope. Now, I'm going to talk about the slope relationships to this sedimentation just a little bit, but in general, you can see that in an area where we have a lower slope, we're going to get more sediment storage. And it makes sense, right? Because the water velocity, that runoff velocity, we expect that to be slower in a lower slope environment, and we're going to allow for more sedimentation to occur. And that's pretty much what we saw here. For these roadside ditches, I was really interested in how the agricultural practices in the catchment itself might influence the amount of sedimentation that was occurring in the ditch. And so what I did is I ran a Russell soil erosion model and got estimates of erosion for each one of these catchments. Now, I will say that in each one of these catchments, the current conservation practice was pretty nil. There were a couple of grassed waterways throughout these catchments, but there were no structural practices of any kind, and all of these different catchments were being tilled. So this erosion rate here at current properties is pretty much a no conservation Russell erosion estimate. And I wanted to see or think about what the different conservation practices might potentially do for sedimentation. So we reran Russell with a couple of conservation practice scenarios. Now, this is a little bit back of the envelope, but I think it's important to think about how we might impact our roadside ditches based on conservation. So we did these Russell scenarios with an example of no-till with a cover crop, if we would add a grass buffer into the site, if we would take some land out of production, that's our 25% meadow, or if we would install structural terraces. Excuse me. And so, of course, based on those C and P values, our estimated erosion rates are going to go down appropriately depending on each one of those practices. This is what's interesting, and I realize that we only have 6 sites here to deal with. So you can argue about the statistical significance of this maybe, but what we identified was this current relationship between the erosion rates and the sediment storage based on these 6 points, and we identified this negative relationship. So you can see that where we had the highest erosion rates or estimates, we had the lowest sediment storage within the roadside ditches, and where we had the lowest soil erosion estimates, we had the highest sediment storage within the ditch. Now, this graph is showing you the current practices. This is the current relationship, okay? So that's based on the current Russell erosion estimates and the amount of sediment that we actually identified. And I mentioned that this is likely due to that LS, that length of slope and percent slope in the Russell model, right? So if we have higher slopes, we get higher runoff velocities, and therefore we get less sedimentation within the roadside ditch. But let's take that sediment storage, linear relationship and add that into a little scenario practice here. So we can see here on the green line at the top right is our current practice. That's that erosion versus sediment storage. And then if we combine that relationship with a trapping factor for each one of these practices. So of course, if we do something like no-till, we get a certain amount of erosion reduction, right? We're going to have less erosion because we do no-till, but we're also going to trap some amount of sediment in that field with that practice. And so we gathered some data from literature, from different sources on some different trapping estimates for each one of these practices. So you can see no-till is estimated about 34% trapping. Grass buffers were the highest amount of sediment trapping, up at 96%. So if we incorporate that sediment trapping and that linear relationship that we identified, we can start to make an estimate on how these practices might impact sediment storage in that ditch. So if we use a practice like no-till, you can see that we get a great benefit as far as soil erosion that's actually occurring in the catchment, but we don't really see a lot of reduction in sediment storage because it doesn't have a high trapping efficiency. On the other hand, if we do something like a grass buffer, the grass buffer really doesn't do a lot for soil erosion in the catchment, but it traps almost all of the sediments that are coming from that catchment. So we move our sediment storage in the ditch virtually to zero. Probably, one of the most expensive practices to install, but the most beneficial in terms of erosion and potential sediment movement into that ditch would be something like a constructional terrace, because we still get a pretty high trapping factor, and we also do a lot to reduce that soil erosion. So with that, I'm just going to summarize here with a couple of slides. That first question that I asked, are these roadside ditches biogeochemical hotspots? I think the answer is probably yes. There's a lot of water that's moving into these places. We have these watersheds that are being, dissected by roads. They're getting a lot of water in these ditches. A lot of these ditches are wet for a significant amount of the year, and they've got potential to do a lot in terms of nitrate reduction. So we determined that preliminary question was to determine how much land was draining into the ditch. 30% of Lime Creek watershed was draining into these roadside ditch environments. We identified a 60% reduction in these nitrate nitrogen rates from that up gradient well to that down gradient well in 4 of those 6 sites. Remember, there wasn't any orthophosphates to speak of in these wells, so I didn't report that. And then as far as the soil sedimentation, we're storing between 239 in that ditch where we had the tile flow, and 988 kilograms per meter of soil in these ditches. So that's a lot of soil that we're storing, a lot of sediment that we're storing. which is in turn storing a lot of carbon. So 16 grams per meter of soil organic matter, and 8 kilograms per meter of soil carbon. Now, I want to mention that we have 3 different papers that we published on this. So 2 in Science of the Total Environment, 1 on the water aspects, 1 more on the soil characterization. And then we also have a paper in Journal of Soil and Sediments that really discusses the sedimentation. So if you're interested in delving into that a little deeper, we certainly can. And I also want to take just a couple of minutes now and talk about future work. So one thing that I would obviously really like to do is to build on this inverse relationship between the soil erosion rates and the sedimentation within the ditch. And 6 points is great as a starting place, and it's nice to think about this potential inverse relationship, but I would really like to do a larger survey of roadside ditches and these catchments to see if that relationship holds true, and to build the significance of that inverse relationship. We are currently working with the Iowa Department of Transportation on a project in Benton County. So Lime Creek Watershed is in Buchanan County, and it just pokes into Benton County on the south end. Benton County has US Highway 30 running through it east to west. That's west of Cedar Rapids. And we are working with the Department of Transportation in a roadside ditch on Highway 30 to look at 2-stage ditches. And these 2-stage ditches are designed to increase the infiltration of water that's flowing through them by effectively essentially creating a floodplain environment within the ditch, so that when water rises, it can move out and increase surface area, increase infiltration, and then potentially have more nutrient reduction benefits. So we're currently characterizing some ditches on Highway 30, and we're going to start developing one of these 2-stage ditches and install that sometime in the next year or so. I hope maybe this fall or next spring we'll get to install one of these 2-stage ditches. Other things to think about is just increasing the retention time within these ditches. So you can build things like these rock berms that you see in this photo on the right. That's one, going to increase the sedimentation within the ditch. It's not going to allow that sediment to move on through a ditch. And it's also going to increase that retention time for the water. So we're keeping water on the landscape longer and allowing those ditches to continue to process nutrients. So things to think about. And with that, I think I'll open it up for questions. I've got, I think, plenty of time. We left a few minutes, so I'd love to hear what you guys think about roadside ditches.
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat, whichever you're most comfortable with.
Matt, really nice job. It's a couple things. How did you estimate the Russell values for soil erosion? What was your hill slope lengths? The assumption is that those are all sheet and real erosion numbers based on Russell. And that doesn't necessarily mean delivery. At some point on those hill slopes, Russell would stop its estimate where you start getting the channel processes dominating. And the other thing is your accumulation in ditches were less where you had higher slopes, and unless I missed something, the slopes you're characterizing are those in the fields and not the slope of the ditch. Is that correct?
So to answer your second question first, we looked at both. So the relationship of that graph where we had the erosion versus the sediment storage, that was, of course, the average slope within the catchment. But I also looked at the slope of the ditch itself. And in general, you can see that the higher ditch slopes also had less sediment. That wasn't statistically significant, but it did appear that there may be a relationship there as well. So these ditches that were steeper seemed to have less sediment in them than the ditches that were shallower. And that was just kind of a quick thing on. I could move back to that to one of these slides if nobody minds. If I could figure out how to move backwards, that would be great. So back here on this graphic showing the roadside ditches, this slope here on the very right side, that is actually the slope of the ditch, not the slope of the catchment. So not a great relationship there, as you can see, but on some of these, lower slope areas, we have some higher sediment storage, maybe some lower sediment storage in these higher slope ranges. And of course, ditch 5 is just really messed up because of that tile flowing into it. So I don't really want to talk about that relationship very much at all. And then as far as the Russell estimates, so we started with that with just the basic statewide Russell coverage, of course. So this was, again, kind of a back of the envelope Russell calculation, but then we incorporated the annual R value for 2017, so you can get R estimates for site-specific locations from civil engineering sources. So we updated that R value, and then the only other thing we did was to incorporate those C and P factors. So other than that, this is just the basic average from the statewide Russell coverage. So not any extensive work to do the Russell estimates in this case.
So delivery was not part of these estimates. Some form of delivery. I mean, delivery is kind of a squishy term anyway.
Yeah, so we weren't actually looking at delivery of the eroded sediments. Instead, we just measured the sedimentation in the ditch to represent that delivery.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question, if that's okay, but if someone else does, I'm okay with that too. I talk to Matthew a fair amount now and then, so but my question actually is, Matthew, I know you said you have heavy metal data and you're not going to talk about much, but since I thought you did a very compelling case on your research, so great job on it. That was fun. But mine's about the heavy metal and even broader than that. You said every 30 years, all these the county engineers, so to speak, the ditch managers, road managers are removing it from the ditches. So that's really nice from a time zero resetting, all that sort of stuff. And so whether it's heavy metals, nitrate, whatever sediment, you can look at it. My question is, where does that sediment they're removing go to? And what does your data suggest for wherever it is being land farmed to? Should they worry about it?
So I think very typically the location of that sediment is directly on the other side of the fence row.
Sure. Yeah.
So a lot of times you'll start to develop almost a berm on the other side of this fence. So in some cases, of course, you get water that's flowing, kind of laterally into a ditch, and you get wide areas where flow is moving in. But more often than not, if you recall that flow accumulation raster, you get a specific spot where where a significant amount of water is entering the ditch. And that's a spot that's been left as a waterway and allowed for water to move into the ditch, because what they do is they move along with a track hoe or something like that, and they dig the ditch and they dump that sediment directly on the other side of the fence, creating that area of higher elevation. So water doesn't want to move into the ditch along an entire transect, but it'll just be in these immediate locations. As far as the heavy metal data is concerned, we did identify a little bit higher lead levels on the sides of the roads, as you could imagine, compared to the sides of the field. Probably the most significant difference was the amount of salts, cations that you would find on these pavements. So we had 3 gravel roads and we had 3 pavements, and the amount of salts that we identified on the road side of the ditch was really high in terms of sodiums and calciums compared to the field sides of those ditches. So overall, you know, the lead levels were not high enough for any kind of what we would call environmental concern. They were still pretty low. So from a where are we dumping the soil perspective, I don't know if it's a major environmental issue in terms of that. Does that answer your question?
It did, and that was what I was curious about. But the other aspect to that was always like with the lead, we outlawed unleaded gasoline about 50 years ago, so that would be buried in the field somewhere.
Yeah, and something important to note here is that when I say next to the road and next to the field, those areas are not getting dug out by the engineer, correct? So yeah. We have the roadside that had a little higher lead level, then we have the lower part of the ditch that was actually getting dug out, and then the field side. So I'm not. I would have to go back and look at the data, but I don't think that there's necessarily a significant amount of lead or anything in that. In the sediment portion, because it's so young anyways, right?
And these are not high intensity use roads anyway. It's more about the erosion. I mean, we're not talking about an interstate or such, so yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to take a PXRF over to Interstate 380 and take some samples in the median, and you know, maybe someday I'll be fortunate enough to get to do that. So
sounds good. Thank you. Sorry about pulling us off on a digression like that, but thank you.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Hi, Matthew. It's Bob Horton. It's good to see you today and really enjoyed your presentation. Very well done.
Thank you.
I wasn't particularly alert on how long the monitoring has been going on. Is this a year-round monitoring that you're doing in the ditches? And if it is there anything interesting you could say about the frozen soil hydrology, especially at the thaw, like at times of thaw, how much, flush of water or nitrate or whatever goes on? Was there anything interesting there?
Yeah, so probably a not exciting answer, but to answer that question, no. So what happens in these environments? First of all, this was just a one-year study in 2017. So we installed those wells in the fall of 2016, monitored in 2017. But what happens in these shallow wells is you'll end up getting a layer of ice that forms just below the ground surface if the water table's high when it actually freezes. And that prevents you from taking any samples, even if you have water that's not frozen at 8 feet below ground surface. And so we have to wait in the spring until that ice thaws from these shallow wells enough so that we can actually start sampling. So what we typically do is go out just as soon as things thaw out, which is typically around middle of March, maybe 1st of April, and we get that pressure transducer installed and start collecting samples then. And of course, in that time of year, we generally see a rise in the groundwater, as you can expect. As thawing is happening, we see a rise in the groundwater. And then we'll also see a bit of a flush of nitrates. So just like in the stream in Lime Creek where we have the nitrate sensor, those nitrate levels are generally higher in the spring of the year, and then they taper off as things warm up and as the groundwater goes down and as the crops start to use a lot of that.
Thank you.
And I would say that's very typical for just general shallow groundwater and not just roadside ditches.
Hi, Matthew. Liz Reiki here. First of all, very nice presentation today. Going back to your title and thinking about these ditches as biogeochemical hotspots, have you thought at all about maybe monitoring for nitrous oxide emissions in the future, seeing that the soils are saturated a decent bit of the time?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea, and it's just one of those things that I'm not equipped to do. And certainly if we had a collaboration with folks that were interested in emissions, that would be really interesting. Yeah, totally. Any other questions? I just pulled up the chat and I realized there's a few things to the chat here.
Matthew, hello. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I got a question. I don't know if it is a necessary question, but I just came to my mind. How did you run Russell? Is it a challenging software to run, or how can I run that if I wanted to?
So actually, it's not software at all in that term. So again, there's a statewide Russell coverage that has all of the basic components of Russell. So that slope length and the K and the C and the P and the R values, it's all right there. And what I used is ArcGIS, and you do a raster calculator. So we have the basic Russell values, and say that a practice factor is a standard of 1 in a location where we don't have any practices. You do a raster calculator and said you can change that to a 0.6, and you just run the equation again. And then you'll get new Russell estimates based on this statewide grid that already exists. So I'm just manipulating the existing Russell values is really all I'm doing.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And a follow-up, like, quick question. Do you think that calculating that as a raster would be a good covariate for digital soil mapping? You took the digital soil mapping course, so I just was curious about your idea. From the Dr. Miller, I mean.
I think it's a fantastic idea for you to take on, Shannon, right there. I'll probably get some hard critiques from Dr. Cruz later about my manipulating the statewide coverage like this. I'm sure it's not entirely appropriate, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Matthew, can you check the chat box? I got a message that a few questions were sent directly to you.
Oh, sure. Yep, I'm checking right now. So a question from Dr. Al-Casey: how did you measure bulk density in gravel spots? There were no areas in these roadside ditches that were really high gravel. In all of these cases, we had some type of sedimentation. And so I didn't really have to worry about high gravels at all. And we didn't measure bulk density on the roadside. These were right in the bottom of the ditch. So those were, we didn't have to worry about high gravel. We did not measure hydraulic conductivity other than slug tests. So we do slug tests in all of our wells. That was another question by Dr. Al-Casey, by the way. So we do slug tests in those wells to get an idea about the hydraulic conductivity of the soils. Let's see here. So Dr. Miller, Gerald Miller asked, were the roads in the Lime Creek study gravel or paved? And did the type of roadbed influence the sedimentation? We chose 3 gravel roads and 3 paved roads. And in general, those gravel roads had a little bit narrower road ditch compared to the paved roads that were a little more wide, but there was no significant difference in the amount of sedimentation between gravel or paved roads. I looked at that and there was not any significance. I think I'm up to date on the chat box now. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Matt, I have another question for you.
Yes, Dr. Al-Casey.
It was a very nice presentation. I enjoy your work. Question I sent in the chat box is related to how did you calculate soil carbon stocks, and how did you estimate it over the length of the ditch? Did you average it over that length, or did you integrate it over the distance, given the different bulk densities across the area?
Yes, so this was what we did, and again, you can look at this graph that I have up right now. We have the actual length of each one of these ditches, and then we have that average depth of sediment, and then the width of that sediment within the ditch. So just a total volume of sediment that's in that ditch. And then we used that mean bulk density. So our bulk density measurements were taken from 2 depths. So we took those from 2 to 4 inches, and then from 6 to 8 inches. So that 6 to 8 inch and 2 to 4 inch depth pretty much encompassed that average 22 centimeter depth of sediment. So we just called that good enough. And we said, we've got an average bulk density for this entire volume of sediment in the ditch, and then multiplied that by our carbon percent. So we measured carbon with an elemental analyzer. So we get percent by weight, and just did the simple math and took that percent by weight, the mean bulk density, and the volume to calculate those stocks.
So is that organic carbon or total carbon?
That is total carbon. So we have two different measurements. One, I showed the soil organic matter. That's loss on ignition soil organic matter at about 16 kilograms per meter. And then the C value is total carbon at about 8.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. O'Casey.
Matthew, I have a question.
Hi, Luis.
How are you?
I'm doing
No,
well.
I just wanted to ask you if you think about like the possibility to use another model to measure the erosion, like WEP, to compare your results with Rusle.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, at the time when I was doing this study, I was looking at using some WEP estimates, but I was using WEP and comparing that to some Russell estimates in another watershed in Johnson County in Rapid Creek. And there were some major discrepancies that I was getting between the WEP results and the Russell results. And so I chose to just stick with the Russell model because it's kind of tried and true and the data was already there. And so I didn't use the newer WEP model, but it's certainly a good idea. Absolutely. And I would like to start utilizing that a lot more.
All right, if there are any other questions, just a reminder that next week, same time, I will be presenting on seed treatment's effects on biological soil health. So I welcome you for next week. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you all.